Ma'am, are you laundering money?
Show this customer the respect she deserves.
Two sentences, spoken seconds apart, that would restore Eleanor Whitmore's faith in humanity. The first came from a bank teller who saw only suspicion in an elderly woman's savings, his cruel words shattering her dignity in front of a room full of strangers. The second came from a man who saw what others had missed, a defender who would teach the 72-year-old widow that kindness still existed in the world. And that sometimes, one act of courage can heal wounds deeper than anyone imagined. This is the story of an ordinary woman whose quiet dignity was tested and the stranger who reminded her what respect truly means. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of First National Bank, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Eleanor Whitmore, 72 years old, stood in the queue with her worn leather handbag clutched against her chest. Inside the bag, carefully bundled in paper bands she had made herself, lay $3,200 in cash. It was every cent she had saved over 6 months from her part-time work at the community center, money she needed to pay her property taxes before the deadline tomorrow. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the counter, not from weakness but from the weight of responsibility she carried. The teller, a young man with slicked back hair and a name tag that read Dylan Price, barely looked up as she placed the envelope on the counter. His fingers moved mechanically across his keyboard, his expression one of practiced indifference. When Eleanor opened the envelope and began counting out the bills in neat stacks, his eyes finally lifted. Something shifted in his face, a subtle curl of the lip that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with unease. Dylan leaned back in his chair and raised his voice just enough for the customers nearby to hear. "Ma'am, that's quite a lot of cash you're bringing in here. Where exactly did this come from?" His tone was sharp, accusatory, as if she had done something criminal simply by existing. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with heat. She tried to keep her voice steady as she explained that it was her savings, her tax payment, money she had earned through honest work. But Dylan's expression only grew more smug, more dismissive. He let out a small laugh and glanced at the teller beside him, as if inviting her to share in his mockery. "I'm just saying, we have to be careful about money laundering these days. You understand, don't you? Elderly people sometimes get used by criminals without even knowing it." His words hung in the air like poison, spreading through the quiet bank lobby. Eleanor felt the eyes of everyone around her turn in her direction. The whispers started, soft but unmistakable. Her hands, which had been steady moments before, now shook visibly as she gripped the edge of the counter. Shame and rage burned through her chest in equal measure. This was not just disrespect, this was humiliation, deliberate and cruel, performed for an audience she had never asked for. The silence in the room was suffocating. Eleanor wanted to scream, to defend herself, to demand the dignity that should have been hers by right. But her voice caught in her throat, trapped beneath the weight of decades of being overlooked. Dismissed, treated as if her age made her invisible or, worse, suspect. She stood frozen, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Then, cutting through the tension like a blade, a voice spoke from behind her. It was deep, calm, and carried an authority that made even Dylan straighten in his chair. "Show this customer the respect she deserves." The words were not shouted, but they resonated with undeniable power. Eleanor turned, and through her haze of emotion, she saw a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit stepping forward. His eyes were fixed on Dylan with a gaze that allowed no argument, no excuse. In that moment, something shifted in the air, and Eleanor felt the first breath of relief enter her lungs. The man who had spoken moved forward with confidence that came not from arrogance but from knowing his voice mattered. Eleanor studied him through the fog of her humiliation. He was 33 years old, she would later learn, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of wealth without shouting it. His skin was deep brown, his eyes holding warmth that contrasted with the steel in his voice. There was something magnetic about him, a presence that commanded attention. Dylan Price, who moments before had been smug in his cruelty, now looked like a child caught stealing. His face drained of color as recognition dawned. He stammered, his hands fluttering nervously over his keyboard as if seeking escape. The other tellers had gone still, watching with wide eyes and held breath. The stranger stepped closer to the counter, his movement deliberate. "This woman came here to conduct legitimate business," he said, his tone even but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "She deserves the same courtesy and respect you would show any other customer. Perhaps more, given that she has likely been a member of this bank longer than you have been alive." Each word landed with precision, dismantling Dylan's behavior and leaving no room for defense. Dylan's hands shook as he picked up Eleanor's envelope. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, barely above a whisper. "I was out of line. Let me process your payment immediately." The transformation was complete. The mocking young man had vanished, replaced by someone desperate to make amends. But Eleanor knew such moments could not be erased. They lived on, branded into memory. She nodded stiffly, unable to find words through the tangle of emotions. Gratitude, residual shame, confusion swirled together until she felt dizzy. As Dylan processed her transaction with trembling efficiency, Eleanor became aware of the man beside her. He remained there, a silent guardian, ensuring the transaction proceeded with proper dignity. When Dylan handed her the receipt, Eleanor turned to face her defender. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way they assessed and understood more than most people noticed. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier but still carrying the tremor of vulnerability. "You did not have to do that. Why would you step in for someone like me?" The man's expression softened, and something deeply human crossed his features. "Pain, perhaps, or memory. Because injustice never gets easier to watch," he replied quietly. "No matter how many times you see it." He extended his hand with a gesture that felt like an offering of fellowship. "Richard Hale. I was here for a meeting. My company partners with this bank on community development projects." Eleanor took his hand, feeling the strength tempered by gentleness. Richard Hale. The name stirred something in her memory. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not been here." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What would have happened is that you would have endured more indignity than anyone should bear. And that teller would have learned nothing." His calm authority had not diminished, but now felt protective rather than confrontational. "The bank manager will be hearing from me about this incident. Count on it." As Eleanor left the bank, Richard held the door open, and she stepped into the cooling evening air feeling as though she had passed through some transformative threshold. The weight in her chest had shifted. Someone had seen her. Someone had cared enough to act. In a world that so often rendered her invisible, that simple fact felt almost revolutionary. The morning arrived with a knock that pulled Eleanor from her kitchen, where she had been nursing a cup of tea and trying to make sense of yesterday's events. Through the frosted glass of her front door, she could see the blurred outline of a delivery person holding something large and colorful. When she opened the door, the fragrance hit her first, sweet and overwhelming, the scent of fresh roses. Mixed with lilies and something else she could not quite identify. The arrangement was enormous, almost absurdly so, a cascading bouquet of white and cream blooms that seemed too elegant for her modest doorstep. The delivery person, a young woman with kind eyes, handed her the arrangement along with a small cream-colored envelope. Eleanor signed for it in a daze, her fingers trembling slightly as she carried the heavy vase inside and set it on her dining table. The flowers transformed the room, bringing a brightness that felt almost intrusive in its beauty. She stood there for a long moment, simply staring at them, unable to process why anyone would send her such a gift. Finally, she reached for the envelope. Inside, on thick cardstock that whispered of expense, was a handwritten note in elegant script. The words were few but they struck her with unexpected force. "Dignity is a currency no one can steal." There was no signature, but Eleanor did not need one. She knew who had sent this. Richard Hale, the man from the bank. The stranger who had defended her when no one else had thought to intervene. Her emotions tangled into a knot she could not unravel. Gratitude, certainly, but also something darker, more cautious. Why would a man like that, someone who clearly moved in circles far removed from her own, take the time to send flowers to an elderly woman he had met for mere minutes? Eleanor had lived long enough to know that grand gestures often came with expectations. Attached, invisible strings that would pull taut when you least expected them. She reached into the envelope again and found something else, a second card she had initially missed. This one was more formal, an invitation embossed with gold lettering. The Hale Foundation cordially invited her to a community dinner honoring local seniors who had contributed to the neighborhood's vitality. The date was 2 weeks away. The venue was the Grandview Hotel, a place Eleanor had walked past countless times but never imagined entering. Her first instinct was to throw the invitation away. She did not belong in places like that, surrounded by people who saw her as a charity case. A token representative of the poor and elderly to make themselves feel philanthropic. The thought filled her with a bitterness she could taste. Yet something held her back. She found herself reading the note again, tracing the words with her fingertip. Dignity is a currency no one can steal. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps dignity was the one thing she still owned outright, the one asset that remained untouched despite everything life had taken from her. Eleanor folded the invitation carefully and slipped it into her purse, tucking it into the inner pocket where she kept her most important documents. She did not commit to attending. She did not even admit to herself that she was considering it. But she kept the card close, a talisman of possibility, a reminder that someone had seen her not as invisible or suspect, but as worthy of respect. The flowers continued to bloom on her table, their fragrance filling her small apartment with sweetness and questions she was not yet ready to answer. Grateful yet deeply suspicious, Eleanor went about her day with the invitation. Burning a hole in her consciousness, a door she could not quite bring herself to open or close. The Meridian Hotel glittered like a jewel box against the evening sky. Its entrance flanked by valets and guests in evening wear that cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent. She stood at the service entrance in her white catering uniform, hair pulled back in the tight bun required by her employer. This was not her first time working an event here, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she knew one of the guests by name, and the knowledge sat heavy in her chest. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece. A work of art featuring orchids and candles that flickered in glass hurricanes. Eleanor moved through the space with practiced efficiency, carrying trays of canapés and champagne flutes. Her presence as invisible to the guests as the air they breathed. She had long ago learned the art of being unseen, of moving through wealthy spaces, without disturbing the careful fiction that such opulence simply manifested without labor. Then she saw him. Richard Hale stood at a podium on the raised stage, his presence commanding the room with an ease that seemed effortless. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, and when he began to speak, his voice carried across the ballroom with a warmth that made people lean forward in their seats. Eleanor found herself frozen near the kitchen door, a tray balanced on her palm, listening despite herself. "We have an opportunity," Richard said, his words measured and passionate, "to rebuild this city without erasing its people. To create spaces where dignity and prosperity are not mutually exclusive. Where the grandmother who has lived on the same block for 50 years does not wake up one morning to find herself priced out of her own history." The crowd applauded, some enthusiastically, others with the polite restraint of people who were not quite sure they agreed but knew better than to show it. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a reluctant stirring of hope mixed with skepticism. These were beautiful words, the kind that sounded noble in a ballroom surrounded by champagne and wealth. But words were easy. She had heard promises before, had watched as developers and politicians spoke of community while bulldozing neighborhoods into dust. The spell broke when the sound of chanting drifted through the walls. Eleanor glanced toward the windows and saw them, protesters on the street below, their signs illuminated by streetlights and the glow of their phones. She could not make out all the words, but she caught fragments: gentrification, greed, Hale out. The accusations hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the elegant atmosphere Richard had tried to create. She watched his face as he heard the chants. Something flickered across his features, a tightness around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that spoke of pain absorbed and held close. But he did not acknowledge the protesters. He simply continued his speech, his voice never wavering, as if by sheer force of will he could maintain the vision he was trying to articulate. When he finished, the applause was thunderous but hollow, more performative than genuine. Eleanor moved back toward the kitchen, her mind churning with questions she had no way to answer. Who was the real Richard Hale? Was he the man who had defended her in the bank? Who had sent flowers with a note about dignity? Or was he the target of those angry voices outside, a billionaire playing at philanthropy, while displacing the very people he claimed to help? The conflicting images refused to reconcile, leaving her suspended in a state of profound uncertainty. As she passed a window, she caught a glimpse of the protesters again, their righteous anger as vivid as Richard's eloquent compassion. And she realized with a sinking feeling that the truth might be more complicated than she wanted it to be. The morning paper landed on Eleanor's doorstep with a thud that seemed heavier than usual. When she bent to retrieve it, she saw Richard Hale's face staring up at her from above the fold. The headline screamed in bold print, "Tech Billionaires Promises Ring Hollow as Residents Displaced." Below it, an elderly couple stood before a building draped in construction netting, their expressions hollow with grief. Eleanor carried the paper inside with trembling hands and spread it across her kitchen table. The article was damning, cataloging promises Richard had made to preserve affordable housing against rising rents and eviction notices in neighborhoods where his projects had taken root. Community leaders called him a hypocrite. Families forced from generational homes shared their stories. The words cut through Eleanor's tentative hope like a blade. She found herself staring at Richard's photograph, searching his face for signs of the deception the article claimed. But the image showed only the same calm confidence she had witnessed at the gala, the same intensity that had compelled him to defend her at the bank. How could both versions be true? How could a man speak so eloquently about dignity while stripping it from others? The sound of footsteps on the stairs outside her apartment pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Martha Chen, her neighbor of 15 years, making her way up with a bag of groceries. Eleanor opened the door before Martha could knock, and the older woman's face was already set in grim determination. "You have seen the news, I assume," Martha said without preamble, setting her bag down on Eleanor's counter with more force than necessary. Her English carried the precise articulation of someone who had learned the language later in life and wielded it with care. "About your new friend, Mr. Hale." Eleanor bristled at the possessive implication. "He is not my friend. I met him once." Martha's eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, fixed on the flowers that still bloomed on Eleanor's dining table. "Once was enough for him to send you those, apparently. Eleanor, listen to me. I have lived through this before, in my country and here. Good men do not build empires. They build communities, families, small things that matter. Empires require sacrifice, and it is never the emperor who bleeds." The words settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket, smothering the small flame of hope she had been trying to protect. Martha was right, of course. She had to be. Eleanor had seen enough of the world to know that wealth at that scale did not accumulate through kindness. Every dollar in Richard Hale's account had come from somewhere, from someone. Perhaps from people like that elderly couple in the photograph, displaced and forgotten. After Martha left, Eleanor sat alone with the newspaper, reading and rereading until the words blurred. She thought about discarding the invitation, about the flowers that now seemed less like a gift and more like a bribe. Doubt seeped into her consciousness like water through cracks, steady and destructive. The man who had defended her felt increasingly like fiction, a carefully constructed persona designed to win trust. What disturbed her most was Richard's silence. He had been asked repeatedly for comment and offered none. No defense, no explanation, just an absence that felt damning. If innocent, surely he would fight back against the narrative threatening his reputation. His silence felt like admission, quiet acknowledgement that the protesters had been right. Eleanor pushed the newspaper away and stared at the flowers, their beauty suddenly cloying. Feeling the weight of her own foolishness for having believed, even briefly, that she might have glimpsed something genuine. The email arrived 3 weeks after Eleanor had decided to forget about Richard Hale. The Hale Foundation offered her a position through their senior employment program. Part-time administrative assistant, flexible hours, a wage that would let her cut back on catering work that left her joints aching. Eleanor stared at the screen, her finger hovering over delete, caught between pride and pragmatism. Pragmatism won. She needed the money. The foundation offices occupied a renovated warehouse building, the space open and filled with natural light. Young people moved between desks with purpose. Eleanor was assigned to records, a quiet corner where filing cabinets stood like sentinels and old paper mixed with fresh coffee. Her supervisor Keisha, a woman with silver-streaked locks and kind eyes, showed her the filing system. "We keep hard copies of everything. Mr. Hale insists on it. Says you cannot hack paper." The work was straightforward, organizing documents and creating order from chaos. Eleanor found comfort in the routine. During her second week, while sorting financial reports, Eleanor found a discrepancy. Budget allocations that did not match their stated purposes. She could have ignored it, but something nagged at her. She pulled the files and began cross-referencing, her hands moving with the precision of someone who once balanced household budgets down to the penny. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. Funds marked for marketing and administrative overhead were being redirected. Eleanor traced the paper trail through 3 different accounts until she found their destination. Senior housing initiatives in neighborhoods facing displacement. Renovations to buildings slated for demolition. Legal aid for residents fighting eviction. The amounts were substantial, millions of dollars moved quietly, without fanfare or press releases. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the documents spread across her desk like evidence at a trial. Her hands were shaking, though whether from excitement or confusion she could not say. This was not the behavior of a man displacing communities. This was something else entirely, something that contradicted everything the newspapers had claimed. She looked up to find Richard standing in the doorway of the records room. He must have just arrived, his tie loosened and his expression weary in a way that made him look more human than she had yet seen him. Their eyes met, and Eleanor saw recognition flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been resignation. "You found the housing funds," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor gestured at the papers, words failing her for a moment. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why not tell anyone? Why let them call you a hypocrite when you are doing this?" Richard stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying a conviction that seemed to come from someplace deep and unshakable. "I let the work speak before the press does. Too many people in this business make announcements before the foundation is poured, take credit before the building stands. I learned that if you want to actually help people rather than just looking like you are helping them, you do the work first. The rest is noise." Eleanor looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt her distrust beginning to crack and shift. Not disappearing entirely, but making room for something more complicated. Quiet admiration mixed with lingering caution, hope tempered by the memory of too many disappointments. She picked up one of the documents, a contract for affordable housing units. "This is real," she said softly. "It is real," Richard confirmed. "And it is only the beginning." The rain came down in sheets that afternoon, turning city streets into rivers of gray. Eleanor and Richard stood in his office, the sound of water against glass creating a cocoon of privacy. He had asked her to stay after her shift, his voice carrying weight that suggested this conversation had been building. Now, as thunder rolled, he stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders tense with memories held too long in silence. "I grew up in Southside Chicago," Richard began, his voice quiet but steady. "Not the neighborhoods tourists see. The real South Side, where streetlights stayed broken for months because nobody cared." He paused, jaw working as if chewing something bitter. "My mother worked as a cleaning woman for office buildings downtown. She would leave before dawn and come home after dark, her hands cracked and bleeding from chemicals and cold." Eleanor watched him, seeing something raw and unguarded. This was not the polished billionaire from the gala. This was someone whose wounds had never fully healed despite all the success piled on top. "She never complained," Richard continued, turning to face Eleanor, his eyes bright with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "She would soak her hands in warm water, wrap them in old towels, and tell me that dignity was not about what work you did, but how you carried yourself while doing it. She made me believe our poverty was temporary, that education and hard work would build us a ladder out." His voice cracked, and he stopped to compose himself. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She knew that kind of mother had been that kind of mother herself, scrubbing floors and pretending the pain did not matter. "Then they tore our building down," Richard said, the words landing like stones in still water. "A development company bought the whole block. 60 days to relocate. My mother spent those days trying to find us another apartment we could afford. There was nothing. We ended up in a shelter for 8 months while she worked 3 jobs. He turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain. She died 2 years later. Heart attack at 53 years old. The doctor said it was stress and exhaustion. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and rage, with the weight of injustice that compounds across years until it becomes almost unbearable. Eleanor understood then, with a clarity that made her chest ache, what drove Richard Hale. This was not about building an empire or accumulating wealth. This was about resurrection, about reclaiming dignity for ghosts and for the living who walked in their shadows. My mission, Richard said, his voice stronger now, is to rebuild communities where dignity can survive poverty. Where a woman like my mother does not have to choose between keeping her home and keeping her child fed. Where displacement is not the inevitable price of progress. He looked at Eleanor, and in his eyes she saw not just determination but a kind of desperate hope. I cannot bring her back. But I can make sure her story does not keep repeating. Eleanor crossed the small space between them, her own eyes wet now, and placed her hand briefly on his arm. The gesture was simple but laden with understanding. You did not just rebuild buildings, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. You rebuilt belief. The belief that someone remembers, that someone cares, that we are not all disposable. Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and in that shared silence something fundamental shifted between them. No longer strangers, no longer merely employer and employee. But 2 people bound by the common language of loss and the fierce determination to make something meaningful from the wreckage. The scandal broke on a Monday morning like a thunderclap. Eleanor arrived at the foundation to find chaos, staff huddled around screens with expressions of shock. The headlines were everywhere: Hale Foundation executive embezzles millions, and beneath it, Black billionaires fall from grace. Eleanor's hands went numb as she read. Caleb Moore, the chief financial officer, had been arrested over the weekend. But the narrative was not about Caleb's crimes. Every story positioned Richard as either complicit or incompetent, invoking every stereotype about successful black men and ill-gotten gains. Eleanor felt rage building in her chest. She found Richard in his office, hands braced against his desk, head bowed as if carrying unbearable weight. When he looked up, his eyes were hollowed with exhaustion and resignation. They want me to step down, he said quietly. The board thinks it will help with public perception. Eleanor's jaw tightened. And you are considering it. I am tired, Eleanor. The admission cost him something. Tired of fighting the same battle. Tired of being guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes guilty even after. Maybe it would be better for the foundation if I just disappeared. The defeat in his voice galvanized something fierce in Eleanor. She thought of everything she had learned about Richard, about the housing funds. And the quiet work done without fanfare, about his mother's cracked hands and the promise he had made to her memory. She thought of her own humiliation at the bank and how Richard had been the only person in that building who had seen her as worthy of defense. The debt she owed was not financial, but it was real and pressing. No, Eleanor said firmly, her voice cutting through his despair like steel. You will not disappear, not while the truth still matters. Not while I have breath to speak it. That afternoon, Eleanor called Sienna Brooks, an investigative journalist known for fairness and depth. When they met at a cafe, Eleanor brought copies of everything she had found. The housing initiatives, the legal aid funds, the pattern of Caleb's embezzlement targeting accounts that would make Richard look guilty. I am 72 years old, Eleanor told Sienna, her voice steady. I have lived long enough to recognize the difference between a man doing harm and a man being harmed. Richard Hale is not perfect, but he is not what they are making him out to be. Someone needs to tell the truth, and if he will not defend himself, then I will do it for him. The interview aired that evening, Eleanor's face calm but determined as she laid out the evidence. She spoke about the bank incident, her work at the foundation. The millions Richard had quietly redirected toward helping communities the media accused him of displacing. Her words carried the weight of lived experience. The response was powerful. Other voices joined hers, residents from housing projects Richard had saved, business owners he had supported, community leaders who had worked with him. The narrative shifted, slowly then gathering momentum. Within 3 days, additional evidence of Caleb's fraud emerged, bank records proving Richard had been a victim. Caleb was formally charged, his frame collapsing under scrutiny. When the dust settled, Richard's name was cleared, but Eleanor knew the stain would never fully wash away. Some would always believe the first version, would always see guilt where there was only the crime of being successful while black. But truth, even imperfect, was worth fighting for. She had fought, and for once, truth had won. The announcement came on a gray Thursday morning in a brief press release that carried seismic weight. Richard Hale was stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Hale Enterprises, removing himself from corporate machinery to devote himself entirely to the foundation. The business world reacted with confusion, but Eleanor understood. This was not retreat. This was return, a man finding his way back to the purpose that had driven him before wealth complicated everything. Eleanor stood in the conference room as Richard addressed the staff, his voice calm but intense. "We are going to rebuild what was damaged," he said, eyes sweeping across faces of people who had stood by him. "Not just our reputation, but our mission. We are going to prove that dignity and justice are not abstract concepts but concrete actions." In the weeks that followed, the foundation transformed. New programs emerged, each carefully designed to address gaps between good intentions and actual change. Richard worked with focus bordering on obsession, but he also listened, attending community meetings in cramped church basements, sitting in crowded living rooms, learning the names of grandmothers who reminded him of his mother. Eleanor's role expanded in ways she had never anticipated. Richard asked her to become a senior financial advisor. "You see things others miss," he told her when she protested her lack of credentials. "You understand what money means when you have never had enough of it." She began developing programs for seniors, creating financial literacy workshops that did not condescend, job training that recognized decades of experience, advocacy groups that gave elderly residents a voice in development decisions. The work was exhausting and exhilarating. Eleanor had spent so much of her life surviving that the opportunity to build something felt almost transgressive. As if she were claiming space she had been taught did not belong to people like her. They worked side by side through late evenings, their relationship evolving into something neither had expected. Not romance, though there was affection. Not friendship exactly, though there was deep trust. Something more fundamental, a partnership forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. One evening, as they reviewed proposals for a new senior housing complex, Richard looked up from the documents and studied Eleanor with an expression she could not quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "Respect is not born from wealth," he said. "It is born from people like you, Eleanor. People who see what needs to be done and do it, regardless of recognition or reward. You taught me that dignity is not something you grant from a position of power. It is something you honor by standing beside people, not above them." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. She thought about the woman she had been when she first walked into that bank, invisible and dismissed, carrying her savings in an envelope and her dignity in tatters. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this room, to this work, to this moment of being seen and valued in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. "We built this together," she said quietly. "And we are only beginning." Outside the window, the city lights stretched into the darkness, each point of light representing lives touched and changed, dignity restored one person at a time. The work was far from finished, might never be finished, but it was real and it mattered. That was enough. 6 months had passed since the scandal, and the city had moved on. But the foundation had not forgotten. On a crisp autumn morning, First National Bank hosted a donation ceremony. The very institution where Eleanor's humiliation began now attempting to make amends through a substantial contribution to senior housing initiatives. The irony was not lost on Eleanor as she stepped through the brass doors. She had once entered with trembling hands and $3,200 in cash. The lobby had been transformed, with elegant flowers and a podium near the windows where light streamed in like benediction. Eleanor wore a simple navy dress, nothing ostentatious but dignified, befitting someone who had earned her place through work rather than wealth. The branch manager approached with a warm smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, we are so honored to have you here as our guest. Your work with the foundation has been truly inspiring." Other staff members nodded and smiled, their recognition transforming Eleanor from invisible to someone worthy of respect. Eleanor spotted Dylan Price near the back, his expression carefully neutral. He had been demoted after the incident. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something that might have been remorse. She did not need his apology. Standing here now, celebrated rather than humiliated, was vindication enough. The ceremony proceeded with speeches about community responsibility, words that sounded hollow to Eleanor but which she accepted as the cost of doing business. When the oversized check was presented to Richard, photographers captured the moment for tomorrow's papers. Afterward, Eleanor stood by the same window where she had once waited in line, her whole body tense with fear. Now she held sparkling cider and watched the city move past, people rushing to obligations, each carrying invisible burdens. The branch manager approached, her expression more personal now. "I want you to know we implemented new training programs after what happened," she said quietly. "Teaching our staff about dignity and respect. It should never have taken your experience to make us do better, but I am grateful it did." Eleanor considered the words carefully. "For once," she said, her voice measured and calm, "I trust people more than numbers. Not because people are inherently trustworthy, but because I have learned to recognize the difference between those who see me and those who look through me. That is worth more than any amount in any account." The manager nodded, understanding dawning, and excused herself with genuine warmth. Eleanor remained by the window, savoring the moment of standing in this space without fear or shame, simply existing as someone who mattered. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that terrible afternoon. When Dylan had mocked her in front of strangers, to the flowers and invitation, to discovering Richard's truth, to defending him when the world turned against him. Each step had been a choice, and each choice had led her further from the invisible woman she had been trained to become. From across the room, partially obscured by the crowd, Richard watched her with quiet pride. He did not approach, did not interrupt her moment of peaceful contemplation. Instead, he observed, thinking the words he would tell her later, when they were back at the foundation and away from all this ceremony. "You taught me what dignity really means, Eleanor. Not the absence of hardship, but the refusal to let hardship define your worth." The autumn sun continued to stream through the windows, and Eleanor smiled, a small, private expression of satisfaction that reached all the way to her eyes. She had come full circle, but she was not the same woman who had started this journey. She was stronger, wiser, and no longer invisible. The restoration was complete. One act of kindness can change the course of a life. When Richard stood up for Eleanor, he reminded us that respect costs nothing and means everything. If someone's kindness once helped you through a dark moment, tell us in the comments below. Share this story with someone who still believes that decency can heal the world. And stay with us for more true stories that prove goodness is never wasted. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.